Hey, we're at IBC 2019. I've just come over to the Sony stand to chat with Alister Chapman about the very new and exciting FX9. So can you tell us all about this camera?
All about this camera?
Yes.
Have you got long enough? So there's a lot about this camera. Obviously on the outside it looks like an FS7 or very similar.
Yes.
But it is actually, almost every aspect of this camera is different to the FS7.
Okay.
So starting at the front, it's a full frame 6K sensor.
Yep.
Now let's be clear out of the box, it does not output 6K and it does not record 6K. So you can't get 6K out of the box.
Yep.
But what it does is it downsamples that 6K to 4K. And something I think a lot of people are missing out on is the fact that if you take an FS7 as an example,
Yep.
with a 4K Bayer sensor, and almost all of the single chip cameras are Bayer,
Yep.
that won't deliver a 4K resolution picture. Because of the way Bayer works, if your sensor is 4K,
Yep.
the resolution is about 70% of that. So you get about 3K-ish, depends on what you're shooting, resolution image. So the FS7's recordings, yeah, they're 4K in size, but what's in there resolution-wise is 3K.
Which I think a lot of people don't really realise that.
They kind of forget that. Because we start with 6K and downsample it in the camera to 4K, the
Yep.
4K recordings that this camera produces are truly 4K.
Yep.
So they are significantly higher resolution than the recordings an FS7 makes.
Yes.
And you can see that in the pictures. They're sharper, they're more detailed, they have better colour. Everything about that image is better.
Yeah.
But the workflow doesn't change. And that's the cool bit, is if you were to record 6K, you'd have bigger files to deal with, much bigger
Yeah.
files, almost twice the size. You'd need new codecs, new workflow, new everything.
Yeah.
And the end result, by the time you've debayered it and done all your processing, is a 4K picture.
Yeah.
So by doing it in camera, you keep the workflow simple. Moving on though, that sensor is designed for this camera. It's not the Venice sensor. And one of the key differences is that this has phase detection autofocus on the sensor. So that means that this camera has a really very, very good autofocus. And I'm one of those people that for most of my career has said, autofocus, this is random. I don't need that, no. And when I got first shown and Sony were talking about this and said, hey Alister, it's got autofocus, I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever. What else has it got?
Yeah.
Then I started using it with the autofocus, and I'm now looking at the lenses that I've got, which are mostly Canon EF lenses, and thinking, damn, I've got to change all my lenses.
Really? Okay.
Because it really is that good. I'm not going to use it for everything.
Of course.
But there's going to be a lot of times, and this is what I think people have to think about. If you're shooting full frame,
Yeah.
you now have the ability to shoot with f2.8, even f1.4,
You're gonna need a bit
full
of
frame
help.
lenses, and your depth of field is nothing.
Yeah.
So you are going to need some help, and I think this is where the autofocus is really, really going to be a big deal in this camera.
Yeah.
Now that sensor as well is dual ISO. So we have 800 and 4000 as the base ISOs in the S-Log mode. And even at 4000 ISO, this camera has significantly less noise than an FS7.
Okay.
And that's a big deal. Something I'm known for, perhaps sometimes even criticised for, is encouraging people with the FS7 to expose nice and bright.
Yeah.
Because if you don't expose nice and brightly, you get the grain comes through, the noise comes through, and
Sure.
it makes it hard to grade and everything else.
Yep.
You don't need to do that with this camera. Just set it at the base EI, base ISO, and shoot, and it's going to be great because there's no noise.
I mean, even that to me, that seems quite alien because obviously I'm so used to exposing to the right with Sony cameras in a S-Log.
I mean, you can still expose to the right and it won't hurt you, but you don't need
Don't have to.
No,
Yeah.
and what that then means, of course, is you're going to get better highlight range and overexposure range.
Yeah.
But again, because the camera is now over 15 stops of dynamic range, you've got just incredible dynamic range at both ends anyway. So a significant uplift in the image quality all round. 6K downsampled to 4K, bigger dynamic range, less noise, all of those things.
Yeah.
And at 800 ISO, this camera is super clean. Really, really is. So that's the obvious stuff. The less obvious stuff, time code in and out on the body of the camera.
You don't have to use the extension
You don't
unit.
have to have the extension unit for your time code in and out. You will still have to have the extension unit if you want RAW, and that will now be 16-bit RAW.
For all the 16-bit recorders we've got.
Well, Atomos have already said they're going to support it, so there will be an Atomos Shogun Neon, or whatever they're going to call it, that will do the 16-bit RAW. And that RAW, potentially, I haven't seen all the details of it, I'm hearing will go up to 120 frames per second in 4K.
Wow, okay.
So, this is a big deal. Lookup tables. You now have lookup tables in S&Q separate to your recording lookup tables, up to 60 frames per second.
Okay.
Above 60 frames per second, unfortunately, you do lose the lookup tables in the current firmware, but you always have a lookup table for the viewfinder. So it's called Viewfinder Gamma Assist, but what it is a Rec. 709 viewfinder for the viewfinder.
Yeah.
So when you're shooting log, doing that 120 frame per second full frame, 120 frame per second full frame HD, it's really cool. At least you're looking at 709.
Yeah.
You're not looking at the log, so exposure, judging your exposure and everything is going to be far, far easier than it is with the FS7. Then we look at really small things. So on the FS7, anyone that has used an FS7 will know that these buttons here, so white ISO, white balance, if you bump those buttons by accident, the camera goes into auto. And it's not obvious. And many a shot, I think, has been ruined by that. So I'm going to use the ND filter as an example. If I press and hold the ND filter button now, I have to hold it for about 2.5 seconds before it will go into auto. And then when it does, there's a little LED inside the button that lights up to say, I'm in auto. And all of these buttons have LEDs in them. If any of these are set to auto, they will light up, and you can just look at the side of the camera and say, oh, that's in auto, that isn't. Much a big improvement. Open this up. Rubber gaskets, so everything is now weather and dust sealed. So there's rubber gaskets and O-rings on every opening and aperture into the camera. All the buttons and switches are all weather sealed. So a lot of effort gone into making it more robust and to stand up to harsh weather and things like that. Locking E-mount, so it's still E-mount, but it's the locking one. Lovely ND filter that is a full frame variable ND filter. Viewfinder, it looks the same, but it's completely different. So this is now a 720p screen, which is it's about 30-40% higher resolution than the old screen, so it's much sharper, it's much clearer. And the way the focus magnification now works is vastly improved. So when you punch in to 4 times and 8 times, it stays sharp and clear. It doesn't go all
fuzzy.
So it looks the same, and whether you like the ergonomics or not, I'm not going to argue with you if you say you don't. But it is a big improvement over what the FS7 has, and there's buttons now for peaking and zebras and an assignable button on the viewfinder. So, almost everything about the camera has changed. The menu is different. It's the same font and typeface, so at first glance you think, oh, it's the same, but then you start looking closely and all the things you use for your everyday shooting, like ISO, gain, white balance. Oh, and by the way, white balance in Cine EI, you can put in whatever you want.
Including you're not fixed now.
No, including a tint. So you can white balance and tint in Cine EI, whatever you feel like. And you can just do that actually. You just press the white balance button and you can use this knob to dial whatever you want in. It's really quick. So the menu looks the same, but all your shooting stuff, so ISO, gain, white balance, shutter, is now grouped in a heading called shooting.
Making life a bit easier then,
and then your things like frame size, frame rate, stuff like that is in a project menu. It's actually a very similar layout to the Venice camera. And it's much more logical. Things are grouped where you're likely to use them together. So at the start of a shoot, you might change your frame size, your frame rate and stuff like that. It's all in the same grouping in the menu instead of having one in base settings, one in camera settings, one here, one there. So, all little improvements right the way across the board that really does make this a much nicer camera to use. It's really, I really enjoy shooting with this camera. The FS7 was always it made a great picture. It does, great camera, but it was always like, why did they do this? So
it's more refined now, it almost seems.
They obviously learned a lot from the FS7. And that's gone into this, and you can see that, and it's a big uptick.
I mean, it's hard for me to tell right now, obviously it's mounted on these sticks, but is it a bit heavier than an FS7? Because it seems
only almost a tiny bit. Yes, it is a little bit heavier. I mean, one of the downsides, so we've got all this processing power for the full frame sensor, all the lookup table options. Another nice thing, Wi-Fi in the camera, and Content Browser Mobile will be updated, and the camera can send pictures now. So you'll be able to remotely control the camera from your phone and see what you're shooting. So you might hand it off to a director. It's cheaper than buying a wireless link and everything else. Just hand it off to the director. He can watch what you're shooting. It's about a 4 or 5 frame latency, so it's not terrible. And that's all
still
built
just
in.
To get that built in is amazing.
So yes, it's a bit bigger, a bit heavier, but it does use twice as much power. So that's the downside. So it's still BPU batteries. You can still use your existing batteries. They're just not going to last as long. So,
and if let's say, do you think that this would mix well with an FS7 on a production, or do you think there's going to be a very noticeable difference?
So this is a new sensor new color filters, new color science. It's different.
Yeah.
And this is really aimed at that much more film style cinema look. So it has the Venice look, and it looks gorgeous. I mean, right here on the Sony booth,
yes,
we've got 2 Venices either side of it. They're all up on monitors up here, and it's really hard to tell which is which.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, I mean, okay, we've dialed them all in to do that, to make them look close, but that's the whole point.
Yeah.
So it does look a little bit different. So you have this now, what Sony call in custom mode, the default setting is S Cinematone,
yep,
which is just a fancy name for the Venice look.
Yep.
And that does give you straight out of the camera in custom mode a very film-like image. So if you're not going to use Cine EI and log and all of that, fast turnaround, and you're doing something you want it to look film-like, you have that out of the box. But of course that's totally different to an FS7.
Of course.
But you do still have the standard gammas, hyper gammas, the same as an FS7 in this camera. And I haven't been able to get them side by side to really look closely. They certainly are very, very close. So for most people in most applications, unless you're trying to do a side by side like for like shot, they will probably cut together.
Okay. That's amazing. Thank you so much for your time there, Alister. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome.